In this video, you're going to set up your very first form. We're going to learn how we can set up the form structure and how we can do something when the user submits the form. We'll have a little text field inside of there, and we'll be able to grab that value, whatever the user types in, and do something with it. In our case, we'll be able to customize the options array. We'll be able to add the user's option right inside of the array, and we'll focus on getting all of that rendered to the screen. Now, we're not going to be working with the counter example anymore. It served us well, but we're going to move this off into a separate file so we can focus on the indecision application. I am going to take this line right here, though, our app root variable, and I'm going to add that up above. We're going to need that regardless of what we end up doing. And then I can take everything from the count variable all the way down to the end of the file, and I can cut that out, adding it to the clipboard. Now that we have it removed, we're just going to put it in its own file in the playground folder. Counter example.js, and we'll leave it over here. It's a good reference. If you ever forget how things work, you can always come back here to remember. Now in app.js, the last thing we got to do is just call react-dom.render. We want to render the JSX above, and we want to render it inside of our application root, the div we set up in index.html. Now, if we save the file, the indecision app should be rendering to the screen. It is indeed rendering, so we're ready to move on and actually start setting up this form. And the structure for setting up the form is going to look identical to what you're used to doing, whether you're using something like regular HTML, Angular, or any other templating framework. We're just going to set up a form tag. We're going to open it and close it. And in here, we're going to put all of the stuff that makes up our form. Later on, we'll have other various field types. For now, we're just going to add two things. We're going to add a text-based input, and we are also going to set up a button. So the goal is to create what we have right down here. We have our text input, we have our button, and that allows the user to submit the form by either clicking the button or hitting the enter key. Later on, we'll be adding some validation, but for now, we're just going to focus on taking a value like test and getting it added into that array of options. Let's go back to localhost, switch over to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to crank out that very first field. This is the input field. We'll be using the input tag like you would inside of HTML, and just like we would inside of HTML, we'll be specifying two attributes. The first is type. That name has not changed, unlike class, which became class name. And we're going to set this equal to, in our case, text. We might use another value like number, email, or something along those lines, password, for example. We just want our regular text input. Now after this, we're going to move on to name. We're going to give our input a unique identifier, something that describes it, and we'll just call this one option. That's going to allow us to actually fetch the text value a little bit later when we listen for the form submission. After the input, the only thing we need is a form submit button, so we are just going to create a basic button tag right here by opening and closing the button tag and giving it some text. Add option seems pretty appropriate, and there we go. We now have the basic HTML structure for the form, and if we save it, the browser is going to refresh, and we will be able to view that form in the rendered output. Now, currently, we do not have a custom event handler inside of our application for the form submission, and we're not going to be adding an on click to the button. Instead, we're going to watch for the whole form to submit. Now, currently, if we try to submit the form, let's go ahead and just click the button, for example, after we type something in or hit enter while focused on the input field. We're going to see we go through a full page refresh, and it dumps that data in the URL as the query string option, which is our name equals test, which was the text we typed in the input. Now, this is not what we want. We don't want to go through those full page refreshes. That sort of technique is useful for older server-side rendered applications. In our case, we want to handle that form submit on the client. We want to run some JavaScript code that pushes an item onto the array and re-renders the application. To do that, we're going to be setting up an event handler for the form submission. Now, there's actually a page in the React docs where you can view all of the event handlers available to you, including the one we already explored on Click. If we go over to the browser and Google React DOM events, we should see this synthetic event page. This is what we're looking for. This page gives us a complete rundown on all of the events available to us. Now, most of these events are also available if you're not using React. You just want to learn exactly what the prop name is. So for example, on uppercase C click for on click. If we scroll down a little bit, the most useful part of this is the supported events table of contents. Here we have clipboard events, we have keyboard and focus events, we have mouse events, selection, touch, all sorts of really cool stuff. We just want to focus on form events. And if we go into form events, we can see there are 3, and we're going to be using onSubmit. So onSubmit is going to allow us to run a function when the user submits the form. If we look down below, we can see mouse events. We have onClick, which we already used, and we also have about a dozen other ones. We have drag events, mouse in and mouse out events, all sorts of really cool, useful events that we can add into our application. In our case, though, we're just going to be sticking with onSubmit. So let's go ahead and switch back to localhost and set that up. Right here, it is onSubmit. And just like we did with our onClick event handlers, we set it equal to a JavaScript expression where we reference a function that we want to have fired when the event happens. Now, in our case, do we have a function? No, we don't, but we're going to go ahead and create one in just a second, and we are going to call it onFormSubmit. Now, we're referencing a variable that doesn't exist, so let's hold off on saving our file until we create that variable. Right here, const onFormSubmit. We're going to set this up as an arrow function. And this arrow function, it actually is going to get called with the event object. And this is something that you'll notice is similar to what we've seen in regular JavaScript or other UI libraries like jQuery. If you set up events in there, you're going to get that eObject back, which contains various information about the events. And for forms, we have a way to prevent that default behavior we saw, that full page refresh. That is e dot, and on the event object, we have access to a method called prevent default. And prevent default, when called, is going to stop that full page refresh, and it's going to allow us to instead just run some code right here to handle the event. Now, it's important to note that you want to reference that function. You do not want to try to call it. If you try to call onFormSubmit, it is going to do this. It is going to get the return value and try to use that inside of the event handler. What does onFormSubmit currently return? Undefined. So this right here would be equivalent to this, in which case we're not going to be actually running our code. What we want to do is just reference the function onFormSubmit. We do not want to call it. Perfect. Now that we have this set up, let's just go ahead and toss a console.log in here to make sure everything is working as expected. Form submitted. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and save this. The application will refresh in the background, and we're going to go ahead and switch over to the console, type some text in, hit enter, and right here we see form submitted shows up. And we also can see we did not go through that full page refresh and no data was added in the URL. And this is exactly what we want going forward. We're creating single page applications, so we're going to handle all of those events right here inside of our client-side JavaScript. Now that our event is wired up, we can go ahead and remove the console.log and focus on actually filling it out to do something meaningful. And step one is going to be to get the value the user typed, if any. So we're going to make a const to hold that value, and we can call this one something like option, and we'll set it equal to, and this is where we're going to dig into our form, starting with e.target. So e.target is going to point to the element that the event started on. So in our case, the target for that event was the form, and on our form element, we have access to elements. So dot elements. And this contains a list of all of the elements, and they are indexed by name. So in our case, the name is option, so that is dot option. And this is the same for regular JavaScript. On option, we have our input, and we're just going to use value to get that value. So we're going to see this here and there following that exact same structure. Aside from pulling off values and using e.preventDefault, there's not a whole lot of interesting stuff for our purposes inside of the event object. Now that we have the option, the first thing we're going to do is check if there is a value typed in. If it's empty, we don't really want to do anything. We're just going to ignore that form submission for now. To do that, we can type if option. So option is going to be a string no matter what, even if it's empty. And an empty string is a falsy value. So if I typed in this right here, this if statement would never run. This condition would always be false. In our case, we're just going to go ahead and reference the string. If there's content inside of it, great. The if statement will run. If it's an empty string, that's fine too. We just won't run this code. What do we want to do right here? We want to push onto our array. The array is app.options. We're going to use push, and we're going to push on that brand new item. We have option sitting right here. Excellent. Now the next thing we're going to do is actually clear whatever input was typed in. So here we have test. That means this would be equal to test. We add test into the array. After we add it into the array, let's go ahead and wipe that input. And once again, we just have to access it from here. So we can take this line exactly as we have it. We can copy it and paste it down below. Then, instead of reading the value, we are going to set that value equal to an empty string. Excellent. Now if we save app.js, the form and the entire application is going to refresh. We can type a value in and we can see what happens. So test, I can hit add option. We can see that test went away and we can guess it got added to the options array. But once again, we haven't set up any sort of re-rendering. So even though we do manipulate the options array, we never tell the React app to re-render itself. So let's go ahead and do that as well. Step 1 is going to be to take all of our default options and remove them. And step 2 is going to be to actually show something related to this options array in the template so we can ensure that when we're re-rendering, we're actually seeing the data change. Now we're not going to focus on changing this just yet. Working with arrays in JSX is a topic on its own. So instead, what we're going to do is just set up another p tag. And this p tag is going to just dump the length of the options array to the screen. So right here, a JavaScript expression, app.options.length. Now, by default, the length is going to be 0. That's what we're going to see here. But as we change the array by adding items and re-render the application, we should see that increment. Now, the items are currently already being added. It's just not re-rendering. So that's actually going to be your challenge for the video. Much like we did with the counter example, we want to create some sort of render function that we can call in multiple places. We want to call it once right away, and then we want to call it after our data changes. Now, for our application, that would be right here, after our data changes, and down below, we would call it just to initialize the app. In there, in that new render function, we would move this, and we would also move this. So let me outline real quick what I'd like you to do. Create a render function that renders the new JSX, call it initially, call it right away to make sure the initial application renders, and then call it after options array is added to. So the end result should be us submitting some form values, and we should see this number tick up. This stuff's not going to change, but that's fine. We shouldn't see this number tick up if we leave the form text empty, because remember, we have a little if statement that checks that. So take some time to knock that out, create the function, call it in those two places, and test your work, ensuring that the count, the options array length changes. When you're done and you've tested your work, you can go ahead and click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get that done without too much trouble. To kick things off, I'm just going to create a function called render. You could have called this anything you like, but render seems like a pretty good name, and I'm going to set it up to take 0 arguments, just like we did for the rendering function in the counter example. Inside of here, there are 2 things I need to add, and both of them already exist. The first one is the creation of our JSX. I'm going to cut that out and paste it in here. And the second one is the actual call to React DOM.render. I'm going to cut that out and add it just below the template variable declaration. Now at this point, we have all of the necessary function related things, but we don't call the function. So we're just going to call it in the 2 locations I outlined here. First up is just right away to render the initial application. We're going to call render. And second up, we want to call it after the options array has been changed. And we're going to put that right here. Awesome. Now we can go ahead and remove the comments related to the challenge. I'm going to save the file and we can test our work. By default, things look exactly the same. We got a count of 0, and if I submit the form with no text value, you can see that the number does not increment. But if I type something in like test, we are indeed going up to 1, and you can see that text also changed. It went from saying you have no options to saying here are your options, and we also got that count updating. And if I keep typing in values, the count keeps updating. So everything is working really, really well. We have our form submission, we're able to get that text value, and we're able to re-render the application. Now this video is a twofer, which means we're going to have 2 challenges. We already did one. The next one is going to be outlined right here. The goal is to create a remove all button. That button is going to sit just above our ordered list of items, and the text is going to be remove all. So right here, create remove all button above list. And this remove all button is going to have an on-click handler, and the on-click handler is going to completely wipe app.options, setting it equal to an empty array. Then it's going to re-render the application. That is going to successfully remove everything from the app, and the count should go back to 0 when it's clicked. So on click, you are going to wipe the array, and you are going to re-render. Now we've done all of this before. You can refer back to the counter example for how on-click works. Take some time to knock this one out and test your work. How do you test your work? You add a few items, you watch the count increase, you click the new remove all button, and you should see the count get reset to 0. Pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock that one out, our second challenge of this video. First up, we're going to go ahead and create the remove all button. That's going to happen just above our list. We'll set the text equal to remove all. And this particular button is going to have an on-click handler. There's no related form to submit, so we do want to explicitly define on-click. What do we want to do on click? We want to reference some function to have called. There's no function just yet, but we can go ahead and define this right here. I will call it on remove all. Now we just need to create it, set it up, and we'll be done. Up above, I'm going to do just that. Const on remove all. Does this function need to take any arguments? No, we don't need any information related to the event. We just need to know that it happened, and we know that it happened because the function is running. What are we going to do? We're not going to try to get any input values or do any sort of validation. We're just going to take app.options, and we're going to set it equal to a new empty array that is going to clear out all of the items, and then we're just going to re-render by calling render. And there we have it. That is how easy it is to add a new feature onto our application. And if we save the file, we can make sure this feature is working. Over in the browser, we start off at 0 as expected. Remove all is going to have no real impact until we add some items, so let's do that. 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can see the count increase as we add them. I click remove all, and it gets set back to 0, and the text goes back to no options. So there we have it. We now have a pretty nice little application set up. In the next video, you're going to learn how to work with arrays. That's going to allow us to render a dynamic number of list items with the individual option text inside instead of static text. Real excited to get to it. Stay tuned. I'll see you in the next one.